photographer by passion and obsession, an educator by accident. These two parallel journeys intersected at a revelation, a realization to look up at the world around me, look up at my students. How narrow of a view or how wide of a view do we have with our current generation of youth? Have we already dismissed them as impossible to connect with, impossible to reach, impossible in general? I think in some ways we may have. And in doing so, we may fail the most connected, at least the most technologically connected, generation in history by missing the details right in front of us. Details, talents that could remain hidden forever because we didn't connect with that student, that child, that person. How many of you have been in a photo in the last 24 hours or taken a photo? You did it with your phones, didn't you? I'll admit I purchased my phone based on the quality of the camera. I'm not concerned about any of the other features. But I'm a bit of a traditionalist in that I still shoot with a real camera, sitting here as my emotional support animal. And I spend a lot of my time looking at the beautiful scenes of the world through a tiny little square, trying to capture a beautiful scene at that moment. I've been fortunate to spend a lot of time in our national parks. And honestly, it makes a photographer's job easy with the beautiful scenes, amazing animals. But for someone like me, it's also infuriating because it's overwhelming and hard to truly capture the scene at that moment. I'll get up hours before sunrise or stay in the same spot for hours just for the opportunity of a shot that may or may not come. Not everyone does this, it turns out. But I forget that not everyone sees the world through a photographer's eyes or with a photographer's brain. And I came to the realization finally that I was spending so much time looking through that tiny little square that I needed to remind myself to put my camera to my side and be there and be present for that beautiful scene. Not put it down, but at least put it to my side. Can you imagine walking through life, seeing everything through that tiny little square? Education has parallels to these characteristics. Let's step back and think for a moment how we as educators prepare to teach our students and to build relationships with them. Learning to be a teacher gives you the bare necessities about doing this, at least in terms of building the relationships with kids. How I thought about teaching when I first started versus how I think about teaching now has changed. How I think about students, or as we educators say, our kids, has changed. I had it wrong, at least in the beginning. When you have this kind of awakening, it can change your actions, your approach, your non-negotiables. And in doing so, I saw a connection to my favorite hobby of photography. Changing your view changes your perspective and gives you a whole new picture. I was a bit of a non-traditional educator in that I didn't set out to become a teacher. I entered the teaching profession by accident when I realized how much I enjoyed teaching when I taught courses as part of my graduate assistantship. I came in from the field of wildlife and conservation biology and decided instead to pursue that field of teaching and join that act of teaching. And I thought that meant being a good teacher meant knowing your content really well, and in my case, maybe getting students a little excited about science. I ended up going all the way through finishing my master's in curriculum and teaching, what should have been the end of my graduate work in wildlife biology, and I never looked back. That was 20 years ago. So I entered my first classroom knowing I knew my content, I was going to get the students excited about science. I had tons of lessons and lectures. I wanted to tell them about ecology and evolution and the inner workings of the cell. I was excited about protein synthesis and the DNA code and cytoplasm and mitochondria. So couldn't I convince them that they should be too? So I gave notes and did lectures. We did labs and activities. I gave assignments. I graded them. I handed them back. But what didn't translate from learning to be a teacher was that importance of building relationships with students first. Making connections. Seeking details to guide my teaching. I got this so wrong. On paper, I thought I had it right. In practice, it was missing something. When you edit a photo, we now have endless opportunities to change things using filters or to change the color. It can completely change the details or the feeling of the photograph. Here's the same shot. What details didn't you notice before? Or how does it feel different? This was the lesson I learned the hard way with my students. What details was I missing? What was I filtering out that I either couldn't or didn't want to see? The burdens and the needs that each child carries with them that impacts their learning. Perspective is everything, not only in education, but in our relationships with others. Here's a shot of the gazebo in the town square of my hometown in Medina, Ohio. Probably taken from the spot that most people would take this shot. But what about this shot? Looking up inside the gazebo. What a different view. What a different perspective. Sometimes in education, it just means changing your language to change the feeling or perspective. What's the difference to a student or to a child to say, complete this assignment, versus, let me give you this opportunity to show me what you know, how much you know it, or how you see this. I have a student I think of now. His name was Juan. Juan and I had many conversations that year, mostly about how he struggled to keep up with the work in the class. But despite that, one of the things I remember about Juan is that he smiled easily. Not always the case with teenagers. Towards the end of the school year, my principal let me know that Juan needed my class and the credit in order to graduate. As a teacher, this makes you feel terrible. Like you hold all the cards and you can't play them for that student. I knew it was going to come down to the points on the final exam. And so I took a different approach with Juan at that point in my career. We had some more conversations, and I offered to him he could come in as often as he wanted. I would give him things to review. We could work on things together. But it would take commitment on his part. And I realized later it would depend on the fact that he trusted me, that I could help him. And so Juan came, and he did. And he did so often. And we had more conversations. I learned about why a high school diploma was going to be so important to him. I learned more about why he struggled in class. And I used that perspective to help him. I knew by then it was going to take for him to get at least a 70% on the final exam, in order to pass the class. Assuming mathematics or grades are the only way to measure a child's progress, which, by the way, they aren't. This was way higher than he had been earning in the class up to this point. So exam day came. And I went to grade his exam. And I graded it again. And I went and got my principal, and we went to the class that Juan was in, and with our apologies interrupted the teacher and asked if we could see him in the hallway. And I showed him the exam. It was the last day for seniors. He had scored a 90%. He not only met but exceeded expectations. And what did it mean? He would walk that stage at graduation. Even now, all these years later, I think of that, and the reason I remember his score on the exam is because I still have that exam. I kept it as a reminder that not only can amazing things happen in the 11th hour when the stakes are high, when it comes to grades and final exams, but it reminds me of the feeling of what it was like to take an investment in a student to impact their learning, to in some way have those conversations, to draw out the details and his skills that gave him the ability to succeed, that gave him the ability to achieve something I couldn't do for him. I couldn't play those cards. I'll never know for sure if my actions actually impacted Juan's story because of course I never asked him. But I knew in my heart there was something different about the investment that time. And it ended perfectly, a perfect ending, a perfect moment. That exam captures that feeling for me, like a perfect photograph. As I said, I don't understand that not everybody sees the world through a photographer's eyes or with a photographer's brain. It takes me forever to take a drive or go for a walk because I'm constantly stopping to take photographs of things that I find interesting or details that I think are beautiful. It doesn't make sense to me that not everybody stops along the way to take pictures of interesting moss or a building that's been left behind with an interesting sign. But that's because those things are beautiful in my eyes, details that I see in my view of the world. We can't miss this key point in the equation, this idea of seeing something from someone else's perspective. And in education, it means seeing it from the student's perspective, each student's perspective, and having those conversations, face to face, eye to eye, many conversations, over and over, and using those details to make those connections. I also can't stand a blurry photograph. No details. Nothing captured, no feeling, as far as I'm concerned. And more so when I'm the one that takes it. I will stand in the same spot and reshoot that picture over and over and over again until I get it right. Because it captures that feeling for me. And when I capture a shot, it gives me a rush, fulfillment, fills my heart, joy. So maybe it's not about the photograph. Maybe it's about returning to the feeling at that instant, or at that scene, or at that moment. Somewhere along the way in my photography journey, I ended up finally getting a wide-angle lens, and I can't live without it now. It captures so much more. Kind of like the feeling when you stretch your arms out, as far as it seems the horizon goes. So how did I miss that all my students had these views of the world that were a million miles wide? And that the better I understood their views of the world, the better I would impact their ability to learn. How did I miss that my students might have 100 things standing in their way that was impacting their learning while I bugged them about the homework assignment they didn't turn in? Over time, it became clearer, and then clearer, became in focus, tack sharp, like a perfect photograph. Years later and thousands of students later, I had learned a lesson. That no matter how much our students may look down at their phones or at a screen, we have to have those conversations to connect, to reach out and seek those details and draw those out. We can't fail at this. And don't we all do this at some point in our lives with at least some of the relationships we have with others? We forget their perspective. We don't consider their view. We can't see it through their eyes, but we can try. Once I left the classroom, in my position that I have now as a curriculum coordinator, I now study the instruction of hundreds of teachers. We're constantly looking for new approaches, new resources, new ways to connect with students in the classroom, to impact their learning. I can give a student a virtual reality headset, and just for a moment, they can be transported to a place that they may never get the chance to go. But for that moment, they're there, and they know what it feels like to be there. We can connect with individuals on the other side of the world with the click of a button. But it never replaces having those conversations with students that change the way they feel, making them feel safe, making them feel valued. You can build a multi-million-dollar school with all the latest technology, and the actions of the adults in the building, or the decisions, or the policies, or the bullying by peers, can still make a child feel worthless, or embarrassed, or invisible. So look up at your view, at your coworkers, It's your family. Step back and look for those details. How will we do this today or tomorrow? What will be the next thing that you see, or the next person in which you try to see those details? And what will you do then? Thank you.